Name?
Ruth Calloway. I'm his mother.
I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on tonight's list.
If she shows up, turn her away. Don't let her make a scene. There must be a mistake. Nathaniel is my son. I gave birth to him in a clinic 40 minutes from here.
There's no mistake.
The rain started before I even reached the gate. By the time the guard stepped out of his little booth with a clipboard in his hand, I was already soaked through, my good coat clinging to my shoulders like a wet towel. "Name?" he asked in the tired voice of a man who hated his job but knew he had no choice. It was a voice you could mistake for rudeness if you've never worn the same shoes. "Ruth Calloway," I said. "I'm his mother." He looked down at his list, ran his finger along it twice, looked back up at me with an expression I'd seen before, pity dressed up as professionalism. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on tonight's guest list." Behind him, past the iron gate, past the circular driveway lined with valet attendants in white gloves, I could see the lights. Gold lights spilling out of every window of my son's house. I could hear the music. He has been married for 5 years and this was the anniversary party. 200 guests, a string quartet, a photographer following my son and his wife around like they were the only 2 people who mattered on earth. I stood in the rain with a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel, because I didn't know what else to bring a man who had everything. And I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap because we couldn't afford to run the heat past 9 o'clock. My good coat was the same navy wool coat I'd bought 11 years ago for my mother's funeral, kept in near-perfect condition because I only ever wore it for occasions I considered sacred. I had considered this one sacred. 5 years of marriage, my only son. I had curled my hair that afternoon, put on the pearl earrings Nathaniel gave me the Christmas after the company's first big contract, stood in front of my bathroom mirror on Miller Street feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a woman with somewhere important to be. Now that same coat was soaked through to the lining, my careful hair flattened against my head, the pearl earrings suddenly feeling like a costume for a party I was never actually invited to. A valet a few yards away glanced over at me with curiosity and a tinge of discomfort, unsure whether an older black woman standing alone in the rain outside a gate was a situation that required his attention or his silence. He chose silence. Most people in my experience choose silence. "There must be a mistake," I said. "Nathaniel is my son. I gave birth to him in a clinic 40 minutes from here. I raised him alone. I sold my wedding ring to pay for his first tool belt." "There's no mistake," guard's radio crackled. He turned away from me to answer it and I heard a woman's voice on the other end. Her voice was calm, clipped, the kind that has never once had to raise itself to get what it wants. "If an older black woman shows up claiming to be family, she's not on the list. Turn her away. Don't let her make a scene." Want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it standing in the rain outside a house I helped build with sacrifices nobody at that party would ever understand. If you're watching this tonight, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, because where I'm from, we don't forget who fed us when we had nothing. Stay with me on this one and hit subscribe if you're enjoying this story and would like to see more like this. I didn't make a scene. I have never in my life made a scene, not even when I had every right to. I turned around, the casserole dish still warm against my chest, and I walked back to my car in the rain. I asked myself the question that had been circling me for 2 years now, quietly, like a hawk that hadn't decided yet whether I was worth the trouble of a kill. When did I become someone my son's wife needed to hide? To understand how I ended up standing outside iron gates in the rain, holding a casserole no one would eat, you have to go back. Not just a few years back, but all the way back to a one-room house on Miller Street in Millhaven, Georgia, with a roof that leaked into a bucket every time it rained hard enough, and a boy who used to fall asleep counting the drips instead of sheep. I was 22 when I had Nathaniel. His father left before he was born, and I never once chased that man down for money or an apology, because chasing a person who doesn't want to be found is its own kind of poverty, and I already had enough of that to go around. I worked 2 jobs, mornings at the poultry plant on the highway, standing on a concrete floor for 9 hours in rubber boots that never quite kept the cold out. evenings cleaning offices downtown after everyone else had gone home, pushing a cart of supplies through empty hallways, vacuuming carpets under fluorescent lights, while my own son slept next door at a neighbor's house because I couldn't afford anyone to watch him properly. I would come home smelling like bleach and raw chicken, and Nathaniel would be waiting on the step of Odessa Marsh's porch next door, because Odessa watched him for free most nights, since she loved that boy like her own. Odessa used to say he was the politest child on the whole street, that he'd sit at her kitchen table doing his homework without being asked twice, like he understood, even at 6 and 7 years old, that nothing was going to be handed to either of us. Nathaniel was a quiet child, but he noticed everything. He noticed when I skipped dinner and told him I'd already eaten at work. He noticed when my shoes had holes in the soles and I lined them with cardboard cut from cereal boxes. He noticed the winter our gas got shut off for 11 days and I told him we were camping indoors, so he wouldn't be scared, and he played along with it for my sake, even though I found out years later he knew exactly what was happening the whole time. There was a summer when he was 11 that the poultry plant cut everybody's hours, and I picked up a third job on weekends, folding linens at a hotel laundry across town. Nathaniel started walking 2 miles each day to a community center that offered free lunch to kids during the summer months, not because I asked him to, but because he'd overheard me on the phone with Odessa, worried about groceries, and decided on his own that one less mouth to feed at home for a few hours a day was something he could do for me. He never told me why he started going. I found out years later from Odessa, who'd watched him leave every morning like clockwork and finally asked him about it herself. An 11-year-old boy, quietly doing the math on his own family's survival and adjusting his life to help carry it. I didn't know whether to be proud of him or heartbroken for him. I have settled over the years on both at once. I remember one Christmas in particular when he was 9. I had exactly $40 set aside for gifts, and I spent 38 of it on a bicycle from a police auction, second-hand, missing one reflector, with a bell that didn't quite ring true. I stayed up until 2 in the morning scrubbing rust off the frame with steel wool so it would look almost new by morning. When he came downstairs and saw it, he didn't ask why there wasn't more under the tree. He just hugged me so hard I nearly lost my footing and said, "Mama, this is the best bike in the whole world," and rode it up and down Miller Street until it got too dark to see the potholes. He noticed the winter I sold my wedding ring, the one thin gold band that was the only nice thing I owned, to buy him a second-hand tool set for his shop class, because the teacher said the boy had real talent with his hands, a gift, and I was not about to let a gift die of neglect just because we were poor. He cried when he found out what I'd done. He was 14, old enough to understand what that ring meant. He sat at our kitchen table and cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry, and he made me a promise that night that I never asked for and never forgot. "One day, Mama, I'm going to build you a house with your own room and a roof that never leaks, and I'm going to buy that ring back if it's the last thing I do." Children make promises like that all the time. Most of them forget by morning. Nathaniel didn't. He wrote it down, actually. I found the notebook years later, a single line in a boy's careful handwriting, dated, like he needed to hold himself accountable to a version of himself that might one day have enough money to forget where he came from. He graduated high school and went straight into construction work, because college wasn't a door that opened easily for boys like him from streets like ours, and he wasn't going to sit around waiting for one to open on its own. He worked framing houses in the Atlanta suburbs, waking up at 4 in the morning to catch a ride with 3 other men in a truck that smelled like sawdust and cigarettes, riding an hour each way because the work out there paid better than anything closer to home. He was good, better than good. Foremen started asking for him by name, giving him the trickier framing jobs, the ones that required a level of precision most of the crew didn't have the patience for. And somewhere in those long hours on other people's job sites, watching how houses were built badly, watching materials get wasted and timelines blown because nobody wanted to think differently, Nathaniel started sketching. At night, at our kitchen table under a single bulb, he drew and redrew a modular framing system that could cut a house's build time nearly in half and use a third less lumber. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a degree. He had a composition notebook full of drawings and a mother who believed every single one of them meant something. I remember the night he almost gave up on it. He was 23, exhausted from a double shift, and he threw the notebook across the room in frustration because a foreman had laughed at him for even bringing it up on site. Nobody's going to take a framer seriously, Mama. I don't have the letters after my name that people like that listen to. I picked that notebook up off the floor, smoothed the bent pages back flat, and put it back on the table in front of him. Only sketches that never mean anything, I told him, are the ones nobody ever shows anybody. You can be scared and still show somebody, Nathaniel. Those aren't opposites. He showed them, eventually, to a man named Marcus Reeve, a small developer who was building affordable housing on the edge of the county. A man just hungry enough and just smart enough to recognize when a framer had handed him a fortune wrapped in pencil lines. The first time Nathaniel brought the sketches to Marcus, still in his work boots, dust on his jeans from a full shift, Marcus barely looked up from his own desk before waving him off, telling him he didn't have time to review a framer's hobby project between real meetings. Nathaniel came home that night quiet, and I asked him how it went, and he just shook his head and said, "Man didn't even really look at it, Mama." I told him to go back anyway. He said he wasn't going to beg a man to take him seriously. I told him there was a difference between begging and simply refusing to let a closed door be the end of the story, and that most successful men in this world have a drawer full of closed doors they walked straight back through. He went back 3 weeks later with a cleaner set of drawings, actual measurements worked out on graph paper he'd bought with money that should have gone toward his truck payment. Marcus gave him 10 more minutes that time before turning him down again, this time a little more politely, saying the concept was interesting, but he wasn't in a position to gamble on unproven methods with his own money on the line. Marcus turned him down twice before he said yes. The third time, Nathaniel brought a scale model he'd built himself out of scrap lumber on his own dime, staying up 3 nights straight after full shifts to finish it, and set it down on Marcus's desk without saying a word. Marcus looked at that model for a long time before he finally looked up and said, "All right, let's talk numbers." That was the beginning of the luck people talk about now when they see my son's success, as if luck is a thing that falls out of the sky onto whoever happens to be standing underneath it, and not a thing built patiently, year after year, by people willing to work themselves to the bone and believe in something nobody else could see yet. There was no luck in those 3 sleepless nights building a model out of scrap wood. There was only a boy refusing to let a good idea die quietly the way so many good ideas do in neighborhoods like ours. The early years of the company were not the smooth climb people assume when they look at Callaway Reeve now. There was a stretch, in year 3, when a major client backed out of a contract after a competitor spread doubt about the untested modular system, and Nathaniel and Marcus came within weeks of having to lay off half their small crew. Nathaniel came home to Miller Street that season looking hollowed out, unable to eat much, terrified he'd built something that was going to collapse and take his one real chance down with it. I didn't have money to give him. I didn't have connections or advice about contracts and financing. What I had was a kitchen table and the same thing I'd been telling him his whole life. "You didn't get this far by being lucky once," I told him. "You got here by getting back up every single time something knocked you down. This is just one more time. It doesn't get to be the last one unless you decide it is." He found a smaller client willing to take a chance on the system a month later, a modest 12-unit project on the edge of the county that nobody else wanted. It went up 2 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget, and word started to travel after that in the way it does among people who build things for a living, quietly. Then all at once, within 6 years, the system Nathaniel designed was being licensed by developers in 4 states. Within 8, he and Marcus had their own company, Callaway Reeve Development, and my son, the boy who used to fall asleep counting rain drips, was worth more money than either of us had ever imagined existed for people who looked like us. The first thing he did with that money, before the cars, before the house, before anything, was buy back my wedding ring. He tracked down the pawn shop records, found the man who'd bought it off the shop years later and resold it through a small estate jeweler, and paid triple what it was worth to get it back. He put it in my hand at my 60th birthday, in front of the whole family and half of Miller Street, and said, "Told you I'd get it back, Mama." And I cried in front of everybody, which I have never once been embarrassed about. I wore that ring every day after that. I still do. If you look closely enough in the rain outside those gates, you'd have seen it catching what little light there was. I tell you all of this not to brag on my son, though God knows I could brag on him for hours, but because you need to understand what kind of bond we had before anybody else came into the picture. You need to understand that this wasn't a mother who was distant, or difficult, or a burden anybody had reason to hide. This was a woman who raised a boy alone in a leaking house, and a son who never once, not for one single day of his rise, forgot who did the raising, which is exactly why what happened next is going to make you as angry as it made me. Nathaniel met Vanessa Sterling at a charity gala 3 years into the company's success, the kind of event where the ticket price alone could have paid our old rent for a year. Vanessa came from old Atlanta money, the kind of family with a name on a hospital wing and a lake house that had been in the family since before anybody could remember why. Her father, Harold Sterling, ran an investment firm that had been passed down through 3 generations and made no secret, from the very first time Nathaniel was introduced to him, of his opinion that his daughter could have done better. I was there for that first introduction, invited along almost as an afterthought, and I watched Harold shake my son's hand with 2 fingers, like he was worried about catching something, and say, in front of a room full of people, "So you're the young man who builds houses. How enterprising." Nathaniel laughed it off at the time, told me on the drive home that Harold was just old-fashioned, that he'd come around once he saw the company's numbers. Harold did come around, eventually, once those numbers got large enough to matter to him. He never once, in 5 years, came around on me. Her mother sat on the boards of 2 museums and a symphony. Vanessa herself was polished in a way that made everyone else in a room feel slightly underdressed just by comparison. She was the kind of woman who could walk into any room in the city and already know exactly who mattered and who didn't. Nathaniel was dazzled by her, the way a self-made man sometimes is by a world he spent his whole life outside of, looking in through a window at a life that always seemed to belong to someone else. She was beautiful and sharp and very, very good at making a man feel like he'd finally arrived somewhere important. I understood the appeal even before I understood the cost of it. I met her for the first time at a dinner Nathaniel arranged at his new house, nervous as a schoolboy, wanting so badly for the 2 most important women in his life to love each other. Vanessa was polite to me that night, complimented my dress, which I'd bought specially for the occasion from a shop 2 towns over, asked me questions about Millhaven with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of smile people give when they're being gracious to something rather than someone. She asked what I did, and when I told her I'd worked at the poultry plant and cleaned offices for most of my life, there was a pause, brief, almost nothing, before she said, "How resourceful," in a tone I couldn't quite place at the time but understood perfectly in hindsight. There was a moment that same evening, small, that I've turned over in my mind many times since. Nathaniel had stepped away to take a work call, and Vanessa and I were alone in the kitchen for a few minutes while I helped clear the dinner plates, an old habit of mine I couldn't shake even in a house with a full staff. She watched me scrape and stack the dishes with a kind of curious, careful attention, like she was studying something she'd read about but never seen up close. "You really did all of this yourself," she said. "Raised him, I mean, on your own with no help at all." I told her yes, that was right. She nodded slowly and said, "That's remarkable," in a voice that made the words sound less like admiration and more like an observation about a species she didn't expect to encounter socially. I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted so badly to be wrong. They married a year later at a vineyard in the mountains, 300 guests, a wedding that cost more than every dollar I'd earned in my entire working life combined. I sat in the second row, in a seat that had clearly been an afterthought. I was moved there the morning of the ceremony from the front row, where the seating chart said I'd originally been placed, with no explanation given and none asked for, because I didn't want to make a fuss on my son's wedding day. I watched my son marry a woman I already had a quiet, unexplainable feeling about. It was the kind of feeling a mother gets, and then talks herself out of because she wants so badly for her child to be happy. At the reception, during the toasts, Vanessa's maid of honor told a long, warm story about the Sterling family's summers at the lake house, about Vanessa's childhood horse and her first debutante ball, and the room laughed and sighed in all the right places. When it came time for anyone to speak about Nathaniel's side of the family, the microphone somehow never made its way to Odessa, who had known him his whole life and had a speech folded up in her purse that she never got to give. I didn't need a microphone to be proud of my son that night. But I noticed. I noticed everything that night, the way you notice a hairline crack in a foundation long before anyone else thinks to look down at the floor. There was also, a few months into the marriage, a Sterling family Thanksgiving I was invited to almost as a formality, the invitation arriving so late I'd already made other plans I ended up canceling to attend. I sat at a table of people who asked me polite, distant questions about life in Millhaven, like it was a foreign country, and Vanessa's mother spent most of the meal discussing a museum gala I had, of course, never heard of and had nothing to contribute to. Nathaniel tried, valiantly and a little desperately, to pull me into conversations, to brag on the company, on me, on anything that might bridge the distance in that room. It didn't take. I went home that night grateful in a strange way for my own small table on Miller Street, where nobody had ever once needed a formality to want me there. For the first year of their marriage, things were fine. Strained, maybe, in ways I couldn't quite name, but fine. Vanessa was busy building her own name in Atlanta society, charity boards, museum committees, the kind of circles where your last name matters as much as your bank account. Nathaniel was busy running a company that had grown into something too large for him and Marcus to manage alone, working 60-hour weeks, exhausted in a way that made him grateful for a wife who seemed to be handling the rest of life, so he didn't have to think about it. I saw them for holidays. Sunday dinners became once a month, then once every few months, always at their house, never at mine, always on a schedule Vanessa set and adjusted at the last minute more often than not. It was small things at first. The kind of small things that on their own mean nothing but stacked up over months start to form a shape. There was the dinner party, about 8 months into the marriage, when Vanessa hosted 20 of Atlanta's most prominent families and asked me, gently,
Ruth, I hope you don't mind. The seating just worked out so awkwardly tonight. Honestly, I thought you'd rather not sit through all that boring business talk anyway.
Of course, dear. Wouldn't want to bore anybody.
I sat in that kitchen eating off good china at a folding table next to 2 caterers who kept apologizing to me like it was somehow their fault. And I told myself it was a one-time miscalculation, an honest scheduling mix-up, nothing more. There was the birthday, my 63rd, that got moved twice, and then quietly canceled altogether when Vanessa's mother scheduled a gala on the same evening and Nathaniel, apologetic and exhausted, said they couldn't miss it, that we'd celebrate properly the following week. The following week never came. He remembered eventually, 3 weeks later, mortified, and showed up at Miller Street with a cake and an apology so sincere I didn't have the heart to tell him how long I'd actually been waiting. There was also the company launch event, about a year into the marriage, for a new affordable housing development Callaway Reeve was breaking ground on back in a neighborhood not unlike the one Nathaniel grew up in. It should have been my moment as much as his. The whole project existed because of a sketch a poor framer's mother once told him not to be afraid to show anybody. Nathaniel wanted me on that stage with him. Vanessa arranged the program instead, and when the MC introduced the family in attendance, I was listed on the printed card in small type as a close family friend, Ruth Calloway, while Vanessa stood beside my son under a banner with the company name on it, smiling for every camera in the room. Nathaniel didn't see the program until after it had already been read aloud. He apologized to me backstage, mortified, blaming a printing error. I wanted to believe him. I let myself believe him for a long while, because the alternative was a version of my son's wife I wasn't ready yet to see clearly. Vanessa began suggesting, gently at first, that maybe I'd be more comfortable somewhere closer to my own community. She said it with such warmth, such apparent concern, that it took me months to notice the pattern underneath the kindness. "Ruth, you must get lonely all the way out on Miller Street. Wouldn't you love to be around people your own age? There's a wonderful independent living community not far from here, very well regarded." I told her Miller Street was my home, that I'd raised my son there, that I wasn't interested in trading my history for a facility with a bingo schedule and a communal dining hall. She stopped asking directly after that, but the invitations to Sunday dinner started thinning. Nathaniel would call, apologetic, saying Vanessa had a work event, or a headache, or the house was being renovated and it wasn't a good time for guests. I told myself my son was simply busy building a life. I told myself a lot of things during that stretch of time that I now understand were kindnesses I extended to a situation that did not deserve them. There was a fall, too, about 18 months into the marriage, that I've never quite been able to think about without my hands going a little cold. I slipped on wet leaves on my own front steps on Miller Street, twisted my ankle badly enough that Odessa had to drive me to urgent care herself, at 10 at night, because I couldn't reach Nathaniel and didn't want to bother him with what I assumed was nothing serious. It wasn't nothing. It was a hairline fracture, a walking boot for 6 weeks, and a doctor who told me, not unkindly, that a woman my age needed to have someone checking in on her more regularly than I apparently did. I mentioned the fall to Vanessa a few days later, in passing, expecting her to pass the news along to Nathaniel, who was traveling for a project site visit that week. She told me she'd let him know right away, that she'd have Dolores bring over groceries so I wouldn't have to be on my feet. Dolores never came that week. Nathaniel called me himself 9 days later, horrified, having only just found out from Odessa, who mentioned it casually at a company event, assuming he already knew. He asked Vanessa in front of me on speakerphone why she'd never told him. She said she must have simply forgotten that it had been such a busy week, that she was sure she'd mentioned it and he'd just missed it in the noise of everything else. Nathaniel accepted that explanation at the time. I remember thinking, even then, how convenient it was that every one of Vanessa's forgetting always seemed to land on exactly the information that might have brought her husband and his mother closer together. The real turn came when Nathaniel's father-in-law, Harold Sterling, suffered a stroke about 2 years into the marriage. Vanessa poured herself into caring for her own parents with an intensity that looked, from a distance, like devotion, and in fairness to her, some of it probably was. But in that same season, she began managing Nathaniel's calendar without ever announcing it as a decision, his calls, his mail. She told him she was simply trying to lighten his load during a hard family stretch, that the least she could do while he supported her through her father's illness was handle the administrative parts of his life he never had time for anyway. He believed her because why wouldn't he? She was his wife and a good one by every visible measure. That was when the letters started disappearing. I wrote Nathaniel every few weeks. Old habit from when he was a young man working out of town on job sites, before cell phones were something either of us could afford easily. I liked writing more than calling. I could say things on paper that came out wrong out loud. I wrote him about Odessa's garden, about the church picnic, about a photograph I'd found of him at 6 years old holding a hammer nearly as big as he was, grinning like he already knew something the rest of us didn't. Small things, mother things. He never mentioned getting them.
Did you get my last letter, baby? The one about Odessa's garden?
Mama, I haven't gotten a letter from you in months. I figured you'd just been busy.
I didn't understand yet what that meant. I would. Dolores had worked for Nathaniel and Vanessa since the first year of their marriage, keeping their house, and in 3 years she had never once said an unkind word to me about either of them, because Dolores was not a woman who gossiped about the family that paid her. But there came an afternoon, about 18 months before that night in the rain, when Dolores called me at home, her voice low, like she was checking over her shoulder even through the phone. "Miss Ruth, I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I found something in the recycling before I could stop myself from looking, and I think you need to know about it." It was one of my letters, unopened, the seal still intact, torn in half and thrown away with the grocery circulars. If you're a mother watching this, you know exactly what that feeling is. Not anger, not yet. Just a hollowing out, like something inside your chest quietly leaves the room. I didn't tell Nathaniel right away. I told myself I needed proof of a pattern before I accused his wife of something so cruel, because I knew, even then, that if I came to him with one torn letter and nothing else, Vanessa would have an explanation ready before I finished the sentence, and I would look like exactly what she'd been quietly suggesting for 2 years. A difficult old woman, imagining slights, unable to let her son build his own life without her hovering over it. There was one evening, about a year before everything finally broke open, when I nearly told him anyway. He'd stopped by Miller Street unannounced, something he rarely got to do anymore, and we sat on the porch with sweet tea while he talked about a hard week at work. I almost said something then, almost told him about the torn letter, about the strange quiet that had settled over our relationship without either of us quite nomming it. But he looked so tired, so stretched thin between the company and his marriage and his father-in-law's health, that I told myself it could wait for a better time, a time when he had the bandwidth to hear it without it breaking something in him. I have wondered since whether that was wisdom or cowardice. Some nights I still don't know. What I do know is that Vanessa called him twice during that visit, and both times when he hung up, some of the ease went out of his shoulders, like a rope pulling gently but constantly at the edges of him even from a distance. So I waited. I watched. And the pattern kept confirming itself, one small cruelty at a time. Dolores found 2 more letters over the following months, both unopened, both discarded the same way. She started, quietly and at real risk to her own job, saving them for me instead of throwing them away, tucking them into her bag and driving them to Miller Street on her lunch break so I'd at least know they'd existed, even if my son never had. I asked Dolores once, over tea at my kitchen table, why she was willing to take that risk for me when she barely knew me, when Vanessa signed her paycheck and I was nothing to her but the mother of her employer. She thought about it for a moment before she answered. "Miss Ruth, my own mama cleaned houses for 30 years so I could go to nursing school before I ended up doing this work instead. I know what it looks like when somebody's trying to make an old black woman disappear quietly enough that nobody has to feel bad about it. I wasn't going to be part of that, whatever it cost me." I have thought about that answer many times since. Dolores had far more to lose than I did in that house, and she risked it anyway, because some kinds of decency don't wait around for permission or reward. She was let go eventually, about 2 months before everything came out, on the pretext of downsizing household staff, though we both understood, without either of us saying it directly, that Vanessa had likely grown suspicious of where her missing letters kept ending up. Dolores never once told me she regretted it. Nathaniel rehired her the week his divorce was finalized, at double her previous salary, and told her plainly that the house wasn't a home to him without someone in it who'd been honest the whole time. I found out, eventually, from Odessa Marsh, who had, by pure coincidence, become friendly with a woman on the intake board of the independent living facility Vanessa had once suggested to me, that Vanessa had called that very facility 8 months earlier and inquired about arranging a placement for an elderly relative who didn't yet know it was being arranged, but would need to transition smoothly once the time came. Odessa's friend hadn't thought much of the call at the time. That kind of preemptive planning wasn't unusual for wealthy families looking ahead. She thought much more of it once Odessa explained who Ruth Calloway was, and what smoothly was likely to mean for a woman who had never once agreed to leave her own home. Vanessa had been planning to have me moved without my knowledge or my son's, using some future crisis, a fall, a health scare, anything plausible enough to justify urgency as her justification once it happened. She was not waiting for a reason. She was waiting for an opportunity and building the paperwork trail in advance so that when the moment came, it would look less like a decision and more like an inevitability nobody could argue with. Odessa told me about that phone call over coffee on her porch, her hands wrapped tight around her mug even though it wasn't cold out. Ruth, my friend Deborah, she sits on the intake board there. She said the woman on the phone didn't sound cruel. That's what got under Deborah's skin about it. She sounded caring, sounded like a devoted daughter-in-law thinking ahead. Deborah said if she hadn't mentioned your name later by accident, she never would have thought twice about that call. I sat with that for a long time. It is one thing to be hurt by someone who hates you. It is another thing entirely to be planned for in advance, by someone speaking about you in the gentlest possible voice while arranging your removal from your own life like a scheduling detail. I asked Odessa if Deborah would be willing to put any of it in writing, if it ever came to that. Odessa said she'd already asked. Deborah, it turned out, had a mother of her own, and had not liked the feeling that call left with her one bit. But let's be clear. This wasn't a woman who disliked her mother-in-law and handled it poorly. This was a calculated, patient, years-long campaign to erase a mother from her son's life, while making sure the son never once suspected there was a campaign at all. Every excuse had a reasonable face. Every exclusion had a soft explanation. That is so much harder to fight than open cruelty, because open cruelty gets confronted. Quiet cruelty gets absorbed, excused, and repeated over and over, until one day you look up and realize 2 years have gone missing from your relationship with your own child, and you can't point to a single dramatic moment that explains where they went. I want to say something else here, because I think it matters for anyone watching who has ever felt this same slow erosion in their own family, on either side of it. Quiet cruelty survives because it never gives you a single moment large enough to point to. You can't take a torn seating chart to a family court. You can't build a case out of a folding table in someone's kitchen, or a birthday moved twice, or a smile that doesn't quite reach someone's eyes. Each piece alone sounds like nothing, sounds like the ordinary friction of 2 women who love the same man learning to share him. It is only when you finally lay every piece down next to every other piece that the shape becomes impossible to unsee. That is exactly what people who operate this way are counting on, that you will doubt your own memory before you doubt their intentions, because doubting yourself is so much easier than accusing someone your own son chose to marry. That's how I ended up in the rain outside a gate at my own son's anniversary party. On a night Vanessa had apparently decided, finally, that I was no longer worth the effort of an excuse at all. I drove home from that gate with the casserole still warm on the passenger seat, and my hands shaking too hard to hold the wheel properly for the first 10 minutes. I didn't cry until I got inside my own front door, the door to the house on Miller Street I had refused again and again to trade away, and I sat down on the same step where Nathaniel used to wait for me after work, and I let myself feel the whole shape of what had happened. I called Odessa first, at nearly midnight, and she came over in her housecoat with a bottle of iced tea and sat with me until 2 in the morning, not saying much, just being there the way she'd been there for 30 years. Then I sat alone with the wedding ring on my finger, turning it slowly, thinking about a boy who once cried at a kitchen table over that ring, and I made a decision I should have made a year earlier. I was done protecting Vanessa from consequences she had earned herself. I was done waiting for undeniable proof, because a mother standing in the rain being turned away from her son's front gate was proof enough for anyone with eyes. I called Nathaniel the next morning. Vanessa answered his phone, which had become its own kind of habit lately, and told me, in that same warm, concerned voice, that Nathaniel was in back-to-back meetings and she'd have him call me when he had a free moment. I told her calmly that I had stood outside his gate in the rain the night before and been turned away on her direct order, and that I needed to speak with my son today, not whenever it was convenient for her to allow it. There was a pause on the line, a very small one, long enough for me to hear underneath the composure something crack. "Ruth," she said, her voice cooling by several degrees, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply managing the guest list for a very important event. It wasn't personal. You know how these things are with so many people to coordinate." "Vanessa," I said, "everything about turning away a man's mother in the rain is personal. Have your husband call me today." He didn't call that day. He called 2 days later, and when he did, his voice had an edge in it I'd never heard him use with me before, tired and confused in a way that told me Vanessa had gotten to him first with her own version of events. "Mama, Vanessa told me there was some confusion about the guest list, and that you got upset and said some things to her on the phone that weren't fair. I told her I'd talk to you, but I need you to understand she's dealing with a lot right now with her father, and I need you to be a little more patient with her." I sat with the phone against my ear, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not hurt. Fury, quiet and cold, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that plans. "Nathaniel Calloway," I said, using his full name the way I used to when he was in trouble as a boy. "I am not going to argue with you about whether I was patient enough with a woman who told a security guard, over a radio, to turn away an older black woman claiming to be family. I was there. I heard her voice. And I have been more patient than any mother should ever have to be for 2 years while my letters disappeared before you ever saw them." Silence on the other end of that call lasted long enough that I thought he'd hung up. "What letters?" he finally said. "The ones I've written you every few weeks for 2 years, Nathaniel. The ones about Odessa's garden and the church picnic and that photograph of you at 6 years old holding a hammer bigger than you were. You never mentioned them, and I told myself you were just busy. But I need you to actually think back and tell me, has your wife ever handed you an envelope with my handwriting on it?" Even once. The silence this time was even longer than the first. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and careful in a way I recognized from when he was a boy trying not to panic. "No," he said, "I don't think she has. I don't think I've seen your handwriting in the mail, and Mama, I can't even remember the last time." 2 years, I said. "It's been 2 years, Nathaniel." That was the beginning of the end for Vanessa Sterling, though none of us knew it yet. That single question, asked in a voice that had finally started to doubt. I told him everything I knew that night, over nearly 2 hours on the phone calmly, without asking him to choose between us, because I did not want my son's loyalty out of guilt or pressure. I wanted it out of truth. I told him about Dolores finding the torn letters in the recycling, about Odessa's friend at the facility, and the inquiry made 8 months earlier with his name on the paperwork as next of kin, a form he had never seen or signed. I told him about every canceled Sunday dinner and every gentle suggestion that I might be happier somewhere far away from his life. I told him about the birthday that got moved twice and then quietly forgotten. I told him about the dinner party where I ate off good china at a folding table in the kitchen with the catering staff. Nathaniel did not call me back again that night after we hung up. I understood because I raised a careful man, and careful men do not act on accusations without looking for themselves first, no matter how much they trust the person making them. What he did instead, I only learned about later, piece by piece, from Dolores and from Nathaniel himself once the dust settled. He went home that night, and for the first time in longer than either of us would admit, he actually looked. He went into the small home office off their bedroom, the one Vanessa called her correspondence room, and found a locked drawer he'd never had reason to open before, because he trusted his wife the way you trust the roof over your head, without checking it for cracks. He found a spare key in a jewelry box she thought he never touched. Inside the drawer, he found 7 of my letters, unopened, rubber-banded together like evidence someone was keeping rather than simply discarding. He found printed records from the senior living facility with his mother's name, typed into an inquiry form dated 8 months earlier. His own name listed as next of kin in a signature that was not his. He found an email draft, never sent, addressed to the facility's admissions director, laying out a transition timeline that placed my move-in date a full year in the future, written the way a person writes about a project with a deadline, Not a human being with a home of her own, she had never once agreed to leave. He sat on the floor of that office for nearly an hour. Dolores told me later, just holding those papers, before he picked up the phone and called her instead of Vanessa, because some part of him already knew he needed someone in his corner who had no reason to lie to him. Before he called Dolores, he called Marcus Reeve first, at nearly 1 in the morning, because Marcus had been there since the beginning, since the scrapwood model on a desk in a small office, and Nathaniel needed someone who'd known him before any of this money existed to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. Marcus drove over that same night, sat with him at the kitchen island surrounded by the letters and the printouts, and told him something Nathaniel repeated to me later, word for word. I remember your mama coming to that groundbreaking on our first project, the 12-unit one, standing in the mud in her church shoes because she wasn't going to miss it for anything. I remember thinking, that woman is the reason this man doesn't quit when things get hard. You don't get to let anybody erase that from the story, Nate. Not even your own wife. He called Dolores that night, well past midnight, and Dolores, finally free to say what she'd been holding for 18 months, told him everything. Every canceled dinner that had been Vanessa's decision, not a scheduling conflict. Every excuse that had been invented rather than real. The folding table in the kitchen. The seating chart moved on the wedding day. Small things that, laid end to end in a single conversation, stopped looking small at all. Nathaniel showed up at my door at 11 o'clock the following night, still in his work clothes, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down on that same front step where he used to wait for me, put his head in his hands, and I sat down beside him the way I had 1,000 times before, and I let him get there on his own. I almost lost you, he finally said, and I didn't even know I was losing you. She made it so quiet. She made every single thing sound so reasonable, one piece at a time, so I never had a reason to add it all up. That's what people like that count on, I told him. That you'll trust the quiet more than you trust your own memory of who I am. That's the whole trick of it. He asked me, that night, how long I'd known. I told him the truth, that I'd suspected for nearly 2 years and been certain for 1, and that I hadn't told him sooner because I didn't want him to feel forced into a choice, and because some part of me still hoped I was wrong about the shape of what was happening. He apologized for that, for not seeing it sooner, for needing so much evidence stacked in front of him before he trusted the woman who raised him over the woman he married. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. A good man doesn't go looking for reasons to distrust his wife. That's not a flaw. It only becomes one if, once he finally sees the truth clearly, he decides to look away from it anyway. We sat on that step for a long time that night. I didn't tell him what to do about his marriage. That was never mine to decide. But I will tell you what he chose to do, because it matters, and because too many stories like this end with the truth coming out and nothing actually changing. Nathaniel confronted Vanessa the next morning with the letters, the printouts, the messages, laid out on the kitchen island of the house I'd been turned away from days earlier. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I'm glad I wasn't, because some reckonings belong only to the two people who have to live inside them. But Dolores was there in the next room, pretending to organize a pantry that didn't need organizing, and what she told me afterward stayed with me. Vanessa did not apologize. She explained. She told Nathaniel that she'd only ever been trying to protect the life they'd built, protect his reputation, protect the future she believed he deserved. A future she seemed to genuinely believe did not have room in it for a woman from Miller Street with cardboard-lined shoes and a poultry plant paycheck. She said his mother's presence at certain events had become a liability to how people perceived the family, that she'd been managing the situation delicately out of love for him, not against him. She said it all like it made sense, like cruelty, dressed carefully enough in the language of protection, stops being cruelty. Nathaniel listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was finished, he asked her one question. You ever, even once, actually try to love her? Or did you just tolerate her for as long as it took to figure out how to remove her? Vanessa didn't answer that question. Dolores said the silence after it went on long enough that she stopped pretending to organize the pantry and just stood there, still, listening to nothing at all. Some silences are their own confession. What Vanessa did say, eventually, breaking that silence, was this. You say that like it's simple, Nathaniel. Like I woke up one day and decided to be cruel to an old woman for sport. I married into a life I never expected to have to explain to anyone, and every single day, someone at every table I sat at wanted to know about your mother, where she worked, where you came from, like it was gossip for them to chew on. I was protecting us. I was protecting the name you built. The name I built, Nathaniel said, has her fingerprints on every part of it. She sold her wedding ring so I could own a tool set, Vanessa. There is no version of this company, this house, this name, that doesn't start with her. You didn't protect anything. You tried to edit her out of a story she wrote. You're being dramatic, Vanessa said. Nobody edited anyone out. I made decisions about how to run a household and a public image, the same way I've made 100 other decisions you never once questioned because you were too busy at the office to notice any of it. Never questioned them, Nathaniel said, because I trusted you not to make decisions like this one behind my back. That's not the same thing as not noticing. That's the same thing as being deceived by someone I loved carefully for years, and you don't get to call my finally noticing dramatic. Dolores said that was the moment Vanessa finally stopped explaining and just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the letters spread across the marble counter like they might rearrange themselves into a version of events she could live with. He came back to Miller Street twice more in those 3 weeks before he filed, not for advice on whether to do it, but I think just to sit somewhere that felt honest while he worked up the resolve to end something he'd once believed in completely. He told me, one of those nights, that the hardest part wasn't realizing what Vanessa had done. It was realizing how easy it had been for her to do it, how willing he'd been, without meaning to let convenience and busyness stand in for vigilance when it came to protecting the people who'd loved him first. I let her manage me right out of noticing, Mama. I need you to know I'm not going to let that happen again. Not with you, not with anybody. I told him that forgiving himself for being deceived was going to take longer than filing the paperwork, and that he should let it take however long it needed to take, because rushing past that particular kind of grief only means it comes back later, uninvited, at a worse time. He filed for divorce 3 weeks later. There was no reconciliation arc for Vanessa Sterling, no tearful redemption where she realized the error of her ways and earned her way back into the family. She fought the settlement, hard, the way people fight when they've spent years building an image and don't know how to survive losing it. Her lawyers tried to frame the letters and the facility paperwork as family miscommunication, tried to paint me as an intrusive mother-in-law whose feelings had simply been hurt by ordinary boundary setting. It might have worked if Dolores hadn't been willing to testify to what she'd witnessed for 3 years, and if Odessa's friend at the facility hadn't been willing to confirm, in writing, exactly what that inquiry call had actually said. Vanessa lost most of that fight because Nathaniel's lawyers were very good, and because judges, it turns out, do not look kindly on documented evidence of a person quietly conspiring to isolate an elderly parent from her only child while forging that child's name on facility paperwork. I was asked to give a deposition during the proceedings, something I'd never done in my life and hoped never to do again. I sat across a conference table from a lawyer who tried, gently at first and then less gently, to suggest that I had misread ordinary family friction as something far worse than it actually was, that people move, that schedules change, that mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law simply don't always take to each other, and that none of it necessarily added up to what I was claiming. I answered every question calmly. I told him about the letters, one by one, dates and all, because Dolores had kept careful track. I told him about the folding table in the kitchen at the dinner party. I told him about the guard's radio and the voice on the other end of it, and I did not raise my own voice once the entire time, because I had spent 60-some years learning exactly how to hold my composure in rooms built to make me lose it. The lawyer stopped pushing after that. Some patterns don't need embellishing once they're laid out end to end in order. Harold Sterling, of all people, reached out to me privately a few weeks after the deposition. I nearly didn't take the call. He was quiet for a long moment once I picked up, and then he said stiffly, in the manner of a man unaccustomed to admitting fault, that he'd raised his daughter to value the right things, and that whatever she'd done, some of the blame for how she measured people belonged to the house she grew up in, not just to her. It wasn't quite an apology. It was the closest thing to one I ever got from that family, and I accepted it for what it was, because I have learned that some people can only ever offer you a partial truth, and refusing a partial truth doesn't make anyone owe you a fuller one. Vanessa moved back into her family's world, back to the circles and the boards and the last name that had always mattered more to her than the man attached to it, and as far as I know, she is still there, still polished, still telling some version of this story where she was the reasonable one, the misunderstood one, the woman who only ever wanted what was best. I have made my peace with never needing her to admit otherwise. Some people never run out of ways to explain their own cruelty to themselves. That's their burden to carry, not mine. Nathaniel sold the house on the hill with the iron gates within the year. He said he never wanted to look at that driveway again without seeing me standing in the rain on the other side of it. He bought a different house instead, smaller, warmer, on a quiet street with actual trees, with a guest suite that has my name on the door in his own handwriting. Carved into a little wooden sign he made himself in his old shop-class habits, because some skills never leave a person no matter how much money passes through their hands. I live in that guest suite 4 days a week now. The other 3, I'm back on Miller Street, in the house with the roof that no longer leaks, because Nathaniel fixed that roof himself the year the company took off, and refused to let anyone else touch it, insisted on doing it with his own hands on a Saturday, even though he could have hired the best roofing crew in the state. Odessa still lives next door. We still sit on porches together most evenings, the way we did 30 years ago, except now there's no bucket catching rainwater between us. And now, some Sundays, my son sits out there too, in an old folding chair that doesn't match anything, drinking sweet tea and complaining that Odessa's tomatoes are better than anything money can buy in Atlanta. I remember the first Sunday dinner after everything settled, months after the divorce was finalized. Nathaniel showed up early, before I'd even finished setting the table, carrying a grocery bag of ingredients for a dish he'd found online and wanted to tempt himself instead of ordering in. He burned the cornbread and undersalted the greens, and we ate it anyway, sitting across from each other at the same scarred kitchen table where he'd once cried over a wedding ring, and he told me, halfway through the meal, that this was the first time in years he'd felt like he was actually allowed to just sit somewhere without managing anyone's comfort but his own. I didn't say much back. I just reached over and fixed a piece of his hair that was sticking up, the way I used to when he was small, and he let me, and neither of us made a thing of it. Nathaniel comes for Sunday dinner every single week now. No exceptions, no last-minute cancellations, no schedule managed by anybody but the 2 of us. Sometimes he brings takeout because neither of us can cook worth much, and we both know it, and we laugh about it every time like it's a new joke. Sometimes I make something simple and he eats 3 helpings and tells me it's better than anything from any restaurant in Atlanta, and I let him lie to me, because it's a kind lie, and I've earned the right to enjoy a few of those. He wears his grandfather's old watch now instead of the expensive one Vanessa bought him for their anniversary. Small thing. He never explained why. He didn't have to. Odessa retired from her own work not long after all of this settled, and Nathaniel insisted on paying off the remainder of her mortgage as a thank you for 30 years of watching over me, and before that, over him, when neither of us had much of anything to offer her back except gratitude. She fought him on it for weeks, told him she hadn't done any of it expecting payment. He told her that was exactly why she deserved it. She finally accepted, on the condition that he stopped trying to fix her porch railing every time he visited, because she liked it just the way it was, wobble and all, since it reminded her of 30 years of a boy hopping over it instead of using the steps. Dolores still runs Nathaniel's household, and by her own account, it is a quieter, plainer place now than it was under Vanessa's careful curation. Fewer galas hosted, fewer seating charts to worry over, more Tuesday nights with takeout containers left out on the counter until morning. She told me once that she'd never seen a house feel more like a home after losing so much of its polish. I understood exactly what she meant. Marcus Reeve, his old business partner, told me once at a company holiday party that he'd never seen Nathaniel work harder or sleep easier at the same time than he has this past year. And I think that tells you something true about what peace actually costs a person, and what it gives back once they've paid it. A year after the divorce was finalized, Callaway Reeve broke ground on a new development back in Millhaven itself, the first affordable housing project the company had ever built in the town where it all started. Nathaniel insisted on nomming the community center at the heart of it after me, over my objections, which he ignored completely, the same way he ignored my objections about the wedding ring all those years ago. There's a small plaque out front now. It doesn't say much. Just my name, and underneath it, one line he wrote himself. For every mother who worked so her child wouldn't have to wonder if he was worth the sacrifice. I cried reading that plaque the first time, standing there in my good coat, the same one, mended twice since that night in the rain, because I never could bring myself to throw it away. I had the coat cleaned and repaired instead of replaced, the seams reinforced by a tailor 2 streets over from Miller Street, because some things are worth keeping even after they've been ruined once, maybe especially after. I think about that sometimes, standing outside a building with my name on it in a coat that once got soaked through outside a gate that no longer exists. Nothing about that circle is lost on me. Odessa stood next to me holding my arm, and Dolores was there too, retired now, invited as family rather than staff, because Nathaniel insisted on that as well. At the ribbon cutting, a local reporter asked Nathaniel what he wanted people to take from a company built on a design his mother once told him to be brave enough to show somebody. He didn't talk about the money, or the 4 states, or the company's growth. He looked straight at me in the crowd and said, "I want people to understand that everything I've ever built, I built because a woman who had almost nothing decided I was worth everything anyway. That's not a sentence. That's the whole business plan. I still wear the ring, every single day. And every time I catch it catching the light, I think about a 14-year-old boy crying at a kitchen table, making a promise he had no business being able to keep, and keeping it anyway twice, in 2 very different kinds of rain. Once when he bought it back with money he'd earned, and once when he chose, without hesitation, to stand outside those same gates with me in spirit, in the version of that night he wishes he'd been there for, every single time he tells this story back to me now. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the mother standing outside a gate, or the son who almost didn't look closely enough until it was almost too late, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more mothers, more sons, and more reckoning still to come. Some people spend their whole lives trying to erase where they came from. My son spent his proving he never forgot it. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that ever really mattered between us. Not the house, not the money, not the ring. Just the knowing that no matter how far he went, he always, always came back for me.